Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final day of Virtual Island Summit. Thank you so much for joining this session. My name is Subhas Adhikari, and I am the Business Development Associate at Island Innovation. I am based in Nepal. For those joining for the first time, Island Innovation is a sustainable development consultancy primarily focusing on island. Our services include island development strategies, impact program design and coordination, capacity building, events, strategic communication, government affairs, and many more. We are trusted by clients all around the world. If you are interested on learning more, my colleague will share information in the chat to connect with us. So today I am very happy to be presenting this session titled The Importance of Safekeeping Indigenous Culture and Languages. Before we begin, you should see a poll appear now on your screen. Please let us know where you are connecting from, which sector and which industry you belong to. All right, so I can see in the chat where we can get people from Mauritius, from Switzerland, from Canada. Today's session aimed to foster a deeper understanding of challenges and opportunities in safekeeping Indigenous culture and language as a part of human heritage. Please use the chat to introduce yourself and share where you are joining from. Feel free to comment during the session. For questions to the panelists, use the Q&A function, and we will address as many as possible during the Q&A segment. So I can see the poll results here. We are we have a diverse representation of genders coming from Europe, North America. I can see from Asia, Pacific, and mostly from academic and private sectors and industry. Thank you for filling out the form and thank you for joining us. Now, I would like to hand it over to our moderator, Nigel Maduro from Aruba. Nigel is a member of our CCGLA cohort this year on COP29. Over to you, Nigel.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone attending. My name is Naja Maduro. I will be currently moderating this session about, just the importance of safeguarding Indigenous cultures and languages. A bit more about myself. I am originally from Aruba, small Caribbean island. I belong to the indigenous nation, the Kakitio Nation of Aruba. And I'm also an intersectional environmental advocate and activist. And I try to find the intersections between social systems, such as indigenous peoples, and also the environment and how they intersect. And I advocate and do actions based on that. I have multiple backgrounds in terms of climate change. I attend multiple conferences regarding climate change. I'm also a sustainability scientist. I'm holding a Master's of Science in Strategic Leadership towards Sustainability. And I have a profound background in activism. So having working in different organizations such as Greenpeace Aotearoa, what also carrying out my actions in Aruba. Here in Aruba, I also am basically the indigenous leader and community mobilizer of the Land Back Aruba movement. And that is basically to safeguard indigenous cultures and also protect and conserve nature for the next generation to come, and to find and reconnect with the balance of nature and people living with nature. So that is basically what I advocate for and my activism work is about. And I also really try to push the importance of advocating and safeguarding indigenous cultures, languages, and ways of living, because ways of living with nature was also something that my ancestors used to do for centuries on end in Aruba, in the Caribbean. And so today I will be your moderator, and I'm super excited to yeah, read through the comments. Everyone could write their comments, their questions in the comments for later on for the Q&A. And I will also be introducing our guest speakers as well, which is super interesting. And I hope all of you will, yeah, enjoy the session today. And they have amazing perspectives, and they can give their perspectives on what they are working on and what they are doing. So, yeah, we could actually start right now. I will first hand over to another person. He is also called Nigel, the coincidence, but yeah, Nigel from UNESCO, Nigel Crawhall. And I will pass it over to him so he can give a proper introduction about himself and what he does in terms of his work. And yeah, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Nigel. It's not often that I end up on panels where the moderator and I have the same name. And every time you say Nigel, I think they're talking about me, but it's usually you. So it's a great pleasure to be with you. Thank
Of
you for the
course.
invitation. And also a great pleasure to meet you as well, Nigel. We've
Yes.
worked a lot with Aruba and we work a lot in that part of the Caribbean. So it's a great pleasure to connect with you. So
Pleasure.
my name is Nigel Crawhall, and I'm Chief of Section for the Local and Indigenous Knowledge Systems Program here at UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Cultural, Communications, and Science Organization. We're a formal part of the UN system. And we're also the lead agency supporting the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. So this is a decade that runs from 2022 until 2032, and it was declared by the United Nations General Assembly. And it's a really exciting and good opportunity to look at why Indigenous languages are so important for sustainability on the planet, their cultural value, but also from the work that my team does, we look a lot at environmental sustainability. So, as Nigel Maduro was saying, Indigenous cultures have had a very long history of stewarding and taking care of country, taking care of territory, both in the marine environment and in terrestrial environments. And for small islands in particular, there is a very special history of the diffusion of humanity across the different islands, dating back thousands of years. And each of those processes of adapting to new environments on different islands at different latitudes has created a flourishing of cultural diversity. So the first thing to say is also that I'm a sociolinguist by training. My background, my professional background is in political science and sociolinguistics. And it's been about since the 1980s that there was more and more evidence that there's a close correlation between biological diversity and linguistic diversity. And in the first instance, the reaction is, well, maybe that's just a coincidence. But it doesn't seem to be a coincidence. It seems to be that the higher the diversity of the biological forms in a particular geographic context, the more it will support different types of sustained human use of that territory. So one of the most outstanding examples, but there are many examples, but one is Papua New Guinea, where you have more than 800 languages just in that island complex. And generally, the Melanesian islands have this very, very high density of indigenous languages from many different families. You also have contexts with Austronesian languages, which are spread all the way from Madagascar to Hawaii, where you have this seafaring culture that established itself across islands across much of the planet. In the Caribbean region, there was equally high levels of diversity, and there's still a lot of linguistic diversity along that coastline of Guyana, Venezuela, Guyana, Suriname, and into Brazil and French Guiana, where there are many languages from different language families. In the main Caribbean islands, there's a long heritage of these languages. And also on the coast, and Belizean coast, you get also Garifuna, which is a language that has combined both Amerindian heritage and language with Afro-descendant cultures as well. So our main point is that the sustainability of languages is first of all important for the people. It's important for memory, identity, but it also plays a very key role in understanding the planet and how it works. So very important words like hurricane actually come from Indigenous languages. And in certain languages, for example, Samoan, they have special terms for the different types of wave swell and even the shape of tsunami waves. So this type of knowledge is critical in terms of human sustainability, food systems, but also taking care of the environment. And UNESCO is very pleased that we're also the lead agency for the UN International Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. And we think there's a great convergence here with the high diversity of Polynesian, Micronesian, and Melanesian languages. It's also a great time to look at how do those different knowledge systems, primarily oral knowledge systems, help inform us in terms of ocean sustainability, which is, of course, a priority to many island states and other small islands. So I think that's a bit of an introduction. It's about the opportunity to look at a global approach to supporting local communities, to supporting national governments, to develop an action plan for the sustainability, the promotion, the stimulation of intergenerational learning, not just of language, but of our whole heritage of taking care of the planet and taking care of each other. And as many Pacific Islanders say, we have many islands, we have many languages, many cultures, but it's the ocean that unites us. And it's through the heritage of voyaging and sharing and connection and taking care of your neighbors, which creates the Pacific identities. So we're happy to support this valuable webinar. We look forward to hearing from the different speakers. And your listeners are very welcome to get in touch with either the UNESCO office in your country or the National Commission, or to go on to the website for the International Decade on Indigenous Languages. So Nigel, I hand it back to you.
Beautiful, beautiful introduction about yourself and the importance as well about the indigenous cultures and languages. You mentioned something earlier that I also put in the chat about, for example, specific words in indigenous languages, such as hurricane. It means huracan in Caribbean indigenous languages. It's basically a god of storms, god of deity, almighty of chaos and just power. And these type of things are needs to be safeguarded and also conserved for, for the understanding of what it is actually, and how does it function. So understanding the culture of specific languages is very important for example, environmental sustainability, or also understanding the livelihoods of people in island nations. So I really appreciate that that just the way that you see the conservation and preservation of these languages as well. It's like super interesting the way yeah, you bring it forward as well. So yeah, but yeah, any other small comments that you have before I pass it on to the next one?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a whole question about the heritage of our understanding of the planet and ecosystems, but these are very much living systems. And so,
Yep.
like right now, we've just published a new report, which is available in English and Spanish. We're going to release a Portuguese and French version about traditional fire management knowledge across the Guyana Shield countries. So many countries are faced with challenges of freshwater systems, of wildfires, and traditionally, Indigenous people managed all these processes, but in the contemporary era, a lot of that is not legally supported. And so when we're talking about languages, we're talking about the whole approach of the society for sustainability. And
Right.
what we're inviting is to work with governments to create an enabling policy environment. So
Yeah.
we are talking about history and heritage. We're also talking about the future of the planet. So Indigenous languages really are taking us forward in the
Yeah.
21st century.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for that. Yes, so now I will pass it on to the next speaker, which is Valen Smith. Valen Smith is currently in Aotearoa. Kia ora, Valens, how are you?
Tēnā koe, Nigel. Tēnā koe te katoa te whānau.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yes, so I mentioned earlier that I was also in Aotearoa for a bit when I was actually working with indigenous peoples. That's when my first work as an Indigenous rights activist started in Aotearoa, working with Maori. So it's an honor and privilege to have you here. So I'll hand it over to you.
Kia ora, Nigel, tēnā koe. Subhash, e mihana ki a koe me te mihi. Thanks for opening us up, Subhash, and also Professor Nigel. Thank you very much for your kōrero as well. I was getting some really good insights in terms of your mahi, and something that resonated with me was the heritage of understanding. And what is the whakapapa, or the genealogy that actually makes that up, and that kind of ties into the kōrero that I'm going to share with everyone today. So it's kind of reframing the conversation from the importance of safekeeping Indigenous cultures and languages to actually the importance of indigeneity in safekeeping cultures and languages. As tangata whenua, as Māori in Aotearoa, we express our indigeneity through our tikanga, or our customary practices. So I'm going to have a look at tikanga, or our customary practices, as shared with me from one of my elders. Tikanga is about doing what's right for the people at that time, and to understand how this keeps our culture and language alive. So I'm just going to break that into the three parts. So doing what's right, tikanga is about assessing any given situation and responding in the most appropriate way. It's about understanding what it is, what is correct, what is needed, what is just, and just doing what's right. So that's the first part. The second part is whatever we do, the right thing has to benefit and uplift our people. So first, it honours three groups of people. The first, it honours our ancestors, and for ourselves to be their wildest dreams. Second, it looks after our tamariki, our mokopuna, the people that are with us right now on this at this time. And the third, it acknowledges our mokopuna's mokopuna, or our grandchildren's grandchildren, those of our whānau who will never meet. And so it's ensuring that the decisions that we make today are going to be sustainable and will echo in eternity. So it's about being a good ancestor. The third part to this, doing what's right for the people at the time, is at the time. And so times change, and our tikanga also change. It changes. It must be responsive and relevant, and it must adapt, just as our ancestors adapted to their circumstances. We too must respond to our changing environment. So tika is not, or tikanga, where our customary practices is not static. It's a living, breathing tradition and guide that helps us to not only survive but thrive. And so it's how we make sense of the world, orient ourselves, remain relevant in every new challenge that we face. So it's in these three themes: doing what is right for the people at that time, tikanga, where our customary practices in Aotearoa gives us a framework to keep the well-being of our communities at the forefront, and responding with wisdom in the moment for the benefit of all of our mokopuna. So now that I've got that out of the way, in terms of what tikanga, or customary practices is, or are, here in Aotearoa, I want to share a recent experience that might illustrate tikanga here in Aotearoa. So for the past 5 years, I've co-led a suite of kaupapa Māori research projects that looks at Māori knowledge, or mātauranga Māori solutions to address biosecurity issues such as kauri dieback. And so we look at solutions that are located in our pūrākau, or our oral narratives. One in particular is the whale, or the relationship between the whale and the kauri. Recently, our research project was criticised in a tweet as a waste of taxpayer money, and labelled as living off the land and ludicrous. So it could have been easy to respond with anger, but guided by tikanga, we understood that doing what is right means taking the high road, choosing respect over resentment. So tikanga reminds us that the wisdom from our ancestors, from our tipuna, comes from staying true to our values. So instead of reacting defensively, as a research project team, we embrace the opportunity to turn this critique into a dialogue that is uplifting for everyone. So knowledge there's a saying, knowledge not shared is not knowledge at all. So we knew this was what is right, is to educate and share rather than argue and reject. So that's the doing what is right part. For the people, our ancestors have taught us that our work is never just for ourselves. It's for our wider communities. It's for the people. And Mātauranga Māori is not just knowledge, it's living, it's a breathing system that guides how we share our land and our community. So that's for our future generations. And the last part is timing. So taking is as often important as the action itself. So the tweet that questioned our work came at a pivotal moment, actually, in terms of my mahi at Auckland University of Technology. This very week, our university was raising awareness of cyber attacks and what that might look like at our university. So what caught my attention was the perpetuation of hateful rhetoric and how this discourse can infiltrate potentially the unsuspecting mind. And so it was crucial to recognize this critique wasn't just about us, it was part of a larger conversation about whose knowledge is valued and whose voices are heard. And so our tikanga, instead of letting the moment pass or being dragged into negativity, we saw this as an opportunity to engage, to spark a conversation, to educate, to uplift for the benefit of all. So the tikanga therefore guides us to take the critique not as a hoha or as an inconvenience, but as a koha or as a gift. So that's just some insights in terms of tikanga is how we express our indigeneity, and through it we keep our culture and language safe. And it's not just about protecting what we have and who we are, but it's ensuring that our culture thrives. So that's just a bit of insight from tikanga in terms of safekeeping our culture and language. Nō reira te whānau, tēnā koe te katoa.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It was beautiful. It was very beautiful. And what you mentioned really struck to me. Being a good ancestor is always the longevity of indigeneity. We also have that in my culture. Being a good ancestor, so we could pass it for the next descendant. So yeah, I really appreciate that. I remember when I was in Aotearoa, I also learned a lot of Maori words. I was like, I'm a host. I have to respect indigenous languages and cultures. I have to, honor the land as well. So I really appreciate it. Thank you, Valence. I will pass it on right now to Ramsay. Ramsay is currently in Hawaii, and I'll give the floor to him because super interesting what he's going to say as well. So
yeah, aloha. Thank you for having me, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, I guess, to everyone out there, and to our fellow speakers. Thank you so much for starting us off with such inspirational thoughts. I'd like to add on to that, but first of all, by saying mahalo, and which is, of course, is more than just gratitude. It means that I have received this deeply, and we're connected now. But if I can, as our kupuna, our ancestors would say, yeah, e holokono no kikino ame ka ohane. E maalama pono ka manao, ke ola ke kino, e kamana wa paoloa. Aloha, aloha, aloha. In those words, it says to unify our minds, our bodies, and our spirits. It says to nurture and care for that connection through all time. And not just while we're here. But see, underlying that statement, that concept, it speaks about connection, not just an internal connection, but an external one as well, to the world around us and to one another. I start with that because I think it picks up on what my colleagues have already talked about, which is this underlying principle of our cultural values, the indigenous mindset, to maintain those things, because for us, it's relational. The concept I just shared is about understanding our relationships to one another. And at the university, Hawaii Pacific University, Pacific Island Leadership Institute, one of our intentions is to restore and reconnect back to the principles of leadership, which is really about relationships with our places, our families, and our communities, based on the values, the principles, and yes, the language, which is a reflection of how we see and interact with the world. It's an important principle because I'd like to suggest, again, relational rather than transactional. Our principles, our language, spiritual language, really speaks about the ability to commune. Our legends, our stories, our elders, those that taught us. When they first arrived in the islands, they did not give the names to the plants and the animals. Instead, they in turn gave their names to our ancestors, our kupuna. In essence, a language is really about communing. Now, communing doesn't necessarily have to be with words. The difference between communing and communicating using a language is when it becomes transactional. There's communing and then there's communicating. And there's a difference between the way we see and relate to our worlds. And so the importance of maintaining and these indigenous principles, these concepts, I would say is even more important when we reframe that from a relational and transactional worldview. Since this is an island innovation conversation, considering if we rescale this, reframe this, that we're all indigenous to somewhere. Some of us have forgotten our indigeneity. We've forgotten our connection, our relationship to our places. And so all of those indigenous communities, especially those island communities, have maintained the memory of that. And I think in the languages and in our practices is that memory. For those of us who have forgotten, we can go back to that. Librarians, if you would, each culture of our particular places. And if we forget, then what do? Do we just start replacing it with our own ideas and thoughts, which are, again, a different concept. Ike, as we say in Hawaii, this notion of wisdom, not just knowledge. Oftentimes we speak about knowledge, but I think we all agree today there's knowledge everywhere. The internet, web, we can find all kinds of knowledge. The question is there wisdom to guide that knowledge? And I think that wisdom, that awareness of how to use properly, appropriately, that knowledge from the land, from the sky and the sea, is embedded in the languages of those that have continued to live in relation with their particular places. The difference, I think, and Nigel, your urgent discussion about the Pacific Islands and our voyaging, this notion that we are connected everywhere. We're connected to one another spiritually, mentally, and emotionally. And so this is a real important concept, to be able to commune and not just communicate, to understand that our principle is really about belonging and not just belongings. The principle of I belong, therefore I am, rather than I think, therefore I am. And it is that relational versus transactional, that our languages, our cultures, and our values, which really speaks to our relationship to our food, our relationship to our land, our relationship to one another. And so I look forward to having a larger conversation about this, but I think those are some of the underpinnings that are so important to us in our Hawaiian culture, because it reminds us of who we are, as well as where we come from, as well as our kuleana, our responsibilities to those that will be coming, following us. So thank you for the opportunity to share.
Absolutely beautiful. The way the philosophy behind the relationship with the land, the sea, and just the culture in general is very beautiful. You mentioned something as well when you first arrived in Hawaii. The names of things. It's just the relationship. It described the relationship. Same as when the Kakitios first arrived in Aruba. Aruba means companion. It's our companion for life. We take care of it. It takes care of us. So it's just a symbiotic relationship, and just with the name itself, Aruba, companion. It tells a story about how you're supposed to take care and safeguard the land and the nature and the water and everything. So it's very beautiful the way you described it as well. I almost teared up. I was like, whoa, okay. Very beautiful. Yeah. So thank you for. Yeah, so now I would like to also invite the other guest speakers. So we're gonna move into our Q&A section. We had a couple of questions as well. So if we could have all the other speakers turn on their cameras, so we could, yeah, have everyone involved. Let me see. So right now, we have a first question already. So I think this one is specifically for Professor Nigel Crowhall, and it is about UNESCO. What are the current efforts of UNESCO to document issues related to Indigenous knowledge peculiar to Indigenous groups globally?
Well, thank you. Thank you for the question. And also thank you to the other speakers. I really appreciate that. Documentation is kind of the default. People often say, well, we have these knowledge systems, therefore everything has to be documented. But these knowledge systems have passed from generation to generation for thousands of years entirely orally. And so we really focus on trying to respect what the community itself wants to do. So there are communities that do their own documentation, and they sometimes do that through writing. They sometimes do that through video or other types of recording work, and they do it with their own legal tradition and for their own purpose. We support various initiatives which include, for example, three-dimensional modeling, where elders and young people build scaled models of their territories to share information internally in the community. That's been used quite a bit in the Pacific and in parts of the Caribbean. But the main question is, what is it that is needed on the ground? What are people looking for? We're also moving into a new area of technology. We've been working with a really fantastic team from Tahiti who have been developing online apps where people can share multiple types of stories and information so they can co-create sharing of Tahitian culture and language, and they're working with other languages as well. So my team, what we do is we support specific community-related initiatives on documentation, mostly such as I put in the chat the fire example. So helping Indigenous people record their own knowledge about fire management and sharing that with other Indigenous people. And then we help bring it into the policy space to make decision makers more sensitive. But at the end of the day, it's the community itself that decides how its knowledge is going to be used, which things are meant for the public domain and which are not, and to respect the free, prior, and informed consent of the knowledge holders. Thanks.
Sweet. Yeah. Thank you. That question was by Samson Afulabi. And now we have another question as well from Anika Bush, where they asked, where can I find the study about correlation of language and biology biodiversity? Is there a published study? I am writing a grant application about traditional knowledge and ocean research. So maybe Ramsey or Valence, or yeah, do we know about a specific study about the correlation of language and biology biodiversity? Is it published?
Valence, you have a thought?
I don't know of any if it's been published. What we do know in the Aotearoa context is that we very much in tune with, aligned to what you were talking about earlier, Ramsey, which is ka koro te whenua kia tātou. So our whenua talks to us, and often our whenua talks to us through onomatopoeia words. And so much of our language is derived from the natural soundscapes within the natural environment. For example, pata pata is the drops of water from the rain, the different bird sounds that we name the birds, like the tui, tui is the tui. And
Yes.
so in terms of the onomatopoeia and the correlation between the natural environment and our language, there's a strong relationship there.
Yeah, likewise. I'm not sure I know a specific study, but we are studying it at different levels. We're currently working with climate scientists at NCAR, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and looking at Indigenous ways of being and thinking when it comes to what we're now calling climate change. But it's really about our relationship to our food, this notion of phrenology. When the animals move, what do we sing? What do we do? There are other programs where song lines, so that you know where you are in relationship to the world. As Valence just suggested, even with us, animals and plants will have similar names. It talks about the relationship again. When this plant appears, the animal will appear. And so that kind of study is important because, again, it talks about the continuity, the relationship between land and sea. One case, a plant called alahe is often near an area where the he or the squid would be. And so if you cut down that tree, you begin to affect the squid in the ocean. It's all relational. So we have 100 names for winds, 100 names for rains. It tells you how and where you should be. So there are those kinds of stories and studies coming out, but I can't give you one specifically. But it's a good question.
Yeah, and I think also it's more of the indigenous wisdom that we pass down from
Correct.
generation to generation. It's not something that we could just write a study about. Yes, it's good to document these things, but we also have to safeguard the importance of oral tradition and just passing it down. Yeah.
And if I may, Nigel, I mean, to Professor Nigel earlier, this is really knowledge transfer. This is how knowledge was transferred over time.
Yes.
And while we call it knowledge, really it is our method of science.
Mhm.
Everything that the science methodologies, it's the same. Our nomenclature may have been different. We used, like you said, oral tradition of moving. It's not just what you say, it's what you hear. But the observation, the practice, the idea of setting up principles, and those are all the practices of science.
Mhm.
And so I think this is also an opportunity to elevate that native science and knowledge, and not just ways of being.
Sweet. Thank you. Yeah, I think it was Valence to mention the thing about the tui because we also have a bird that's called chuchubi and it's onomatopoeia because it sounds like it's saying chuchubi. So it's the same thing. So yeah. Next question is by Ian Niblock and it says they say, could you comment on the UNESCO Intangible Heritage List, please? And if these are expanding much with the 2022-2032 agenda. This is for Nigel Crawhall.
Thank you. I put in the chat a link to a new publication that came out, supported by the government of Brazil, on indigenous peoples and intangible cultural heritage. So under the UNESCO Cultural Conventions, we have the 2003 Convention on the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage, and we have a program running on what's called living heritage, so the transmission issues in many communities. Because the decade itself is relatively new, we now have growing attention by communities to look at the safeguarding of their language and knowledge transmission. But also we have a fast track system if there's actually a real threat to the sort of immediate loss of language or culture for whatever reason that it's happening. It can be climactic, it can be other activities that are going on. There is an emergency fund to support communities that want to help protect their intangible cultural heritage. But what I think we're going to see is a big growth in awareness that languages are inseparable from the territories where they were born and where when we talk about the biodiversity and culture, these are interactive processes. So people shape their landscape. And I think a number of people in this group have also followed the recent discussion. There was a sort of a Western European historiography that argued that the Easter Islands, collapsed from overuse of resources. And the new research coming out is saying that's in fact not true. That's not what happened. And I think this is what is so outstanding, is that it takes very special skills to live sustainably on small islands over long periods of time. And that's exactly the heritage of the Caribbean and the Pacific particularly. And so there's still a great deal to learn about what is sustainability. This is why we constantly put the emphasis is not about the past. The past is very important, but it's really about the future and trying to encourage young people to get involved in looking for sustainable solutions for their islands, drawing on ancestral knowledge, drawing on ancestral value systems. So you're more than welcome also to get in touch with your national UNESCO office, the National Commission, or the Convention on Safeguarding Intangible Cultural Heritage. Thanks.
Thank you. So I saw a comment in the chat. It says it's by Tepora Wright. Great panel discussion and amazing speakers and moderation. Appreciate it. Wondering though, whether intentional to have an absence of women in the panel lineup today. Thank you. I think that's very important as well to also include women, Indigenous women specifically, in these type of conversations too, because they have a specific and very important perspective. So it's good to keep that in mind for example, for the next panel discussion about indigeneity, cultures, languages, to also include Indigenous women in these important conversations as well. So I think more diversity is always important. Now, for a comment by Sarita Williams, a question as well. Thank you for such an excellent and inspiring talks. I'm wondering, how do you each deal with the challenges that globalization presents for the preservation of Indigenous languages, especially among younger generation?
I might start us off. Thank you. What a great question. Globalization, what a big thing to tackle. And I suppose when you have something as huge as that, I suppose all you can do is, you know, only control the stuff that you can control. And so I'll say that using a couple of stories that won't take too long, hopefully. So often when we go to the supermarket, my wife and I, we speak te reo, our native tongue, our mother tongue, to our three tamariki all the time. And more often than not, someone comes up to us and compliments us on speaking te reo Māori to our children. And we say, oh, thank you. Something that we all do all the time at home and also out in our public spaces and so on. And so I'm looking forward to a time when nobody says that, when actually this is just a normal part of our environment, where there's nothing to see here. It's just te reo Māori, and it's just a normal part and natural part of our, I suppose, national existence. The second part to that is that I started AUT in 2004. It's now 20 years since then, and I started as I couldn't even string a Māori sentence together. Now, I learned te reo at the university, at my place of work, and I was surrounded by kaumātua and knowledge experts. And so what we need to ensure, especially when it comes to our rangatahi, our young people and our young Māori coming into university, we need to also upskill and uplift our tangata whenua within our organisations if we are to meet the needs of our rangatahi. They have a strong expectation from their university that we can meet their needs culturally, and a lot of that is through the reo. So it's about also being responsive to that need, and then therefore as an organisation, what are we going to do about it? Wouldn't it be wonderful to go back home after leaving work feeling more connected to your language, and therefore that's a benefit for your whānau?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great question, Nigel. Thank you, Valence. I totally agree. There's a concept that we say we teach people how to treat us. I think we have a responsibility in the same way that our children learn, that we learn from our ancestors, is through modeling. And if we don't model the way we interact with one another in our places, then clearly someone will take the opportunity to fill in what they think they ought to be the behavior. And so this is when we start running into the concepts of cultural appropriation, is when someone wants something that they don't have elsewhere, and they begin to accrue that for themselves. Well, all of a sudden, the language is changing because of the way they hear it. And what they may not realize is that the spiritual energy behind that word, that use, is actually shifting how that word's affecting the people around you. Simply because I'm saying it doesn't mean that I'm actually affecting that thing, as I suggested earlier, communing. So it's important that we in our places find an ability to express that, to share, and to guide and to teach, because we have a responsibility to our places as well as to our visitors, so that they don't get hurt or are harmed. And I think that's the idea. It's all one island called Earth. Mm-hmm. And as islanders, how do we begin to communicate with one another and to be able to say, in your place, it's one way, in our place, it's another. And in both cases, the multiple truths are important. This is the power of diversity and inclusion. How do we include others, but maintain the diversity that makes this island Earth what it really is? A beautiful island to all of us living it. But we teach people how to treat us. And I think we have a responsibility to ourselves, our families, our communities, as well as to our visitors, our friends, neighbors, to be able to share that with them.
Sweet.
Nigel, maybe if I can just add one word, because Ramsey was inspiring me there, but I helped put together with other colleagues a dialogue of religious and spiritual leaders about nature and about conservation in Honolulu, of course. Where else would it be? And there was a big dialogue going on with one of the traditional Hawaiian leaders, and the Japanese delegate who was on the stage said, we have a word for exactly what you're talking about. We resonate with what you're saying. And we use this word kotodama. And kotodama in Japanese means word spirit, that what you say brings things into being. And the relationship between people and land and the sea, between neighbors, is all shaped by the mindfulness of what we say. And switching languages it's great that we have all this linguistic diversity, but in fact, different languages bring a different spiritual meaning and a different dynamic in communities and relationships to custodianship. And so there's a whole other dimension that you only really know from inside the process. And so it's just about saying that this is a intergenerational opportunity, but it's also a global opportunity. So speaking te reo at the supermarket should be completely the most normal thing in the world. And it's about creating the world that we want to live in.
Yeah, and how I deal with the challenges, well, I usually have it at home in terms of globalization. So my little cousins, usually when they watch TV or they watch these little shows, they pick up on the English words of certain things. Or in Aruba, we are multilingual, so they borrow or adopt words from other languages instead of using the indigenous words. So, for example, I remember my little cousin was watching a show about just this cartoon, and he saw a whirlwind, a tornado, and he was like, "Oh, look, a tornado!" And I corrected him. I'm like, "Oh yeah, a waru." He's like, "What's a waru?" And then that's where my moment was like, "Hey, this is actually the indigenous words. It's just these little nudges in the younger generation to let them learn as well." In that moment, it's like, "Oh, okay, that's so cool. We have our own word for it." So yeah. We have another question from Ana Victoria Barong. And they mentioned, they asked, how can school systems in island communities implement culturally responsive curriculum and policies that effectively safeguard um, and promote indigenous languages and tradition while balancing modern educational demands?
Good question.
Mm-hmm.
Valence, I'll toss that to you.
I
The
was
reason I'm saying
thinking,
that
I'll give.
because our Punana Leo program in Hawaii, which is really the restoration of language through an immersion program, in many ways was inspired by our cousins in New Zealand. And now we have many of our children that have grown up in the language. We had to restore the language because, of course, when the country was overthrown in 1893, our language was obliterated, it went underground. Fortunately, it wasn't lost completely. But I think that's the idea of immersing ourselves in it. So we're using it not as a cultural thing. The idea that I'm going to go and do my cultural thing and come back to life tomorrow, my real life. Honey, I'm going to do my cultural thing and I'll be back later. Right? If it's your culture, you live it. And I think that's the difference. It's not about learning it in one place and then applying it someplace, but it's living it all the time and finding an appropriate time to be able to use it. To your point earlier about being able to use it at the grocery store at home. And it's not because it's a cultural thing. It's the way we are. That's the way. And to be able to code switch it if we have to. And that's where we talk about communicating in a way that's important. But I think through immersion programs, but they need to be tied also to the cultural principles, because we run the risk of just speaking the dominant language, in our case, English, but we're just using Hawaiian words to speak English. And we begin to forget what the underlying meanings, which is what this all about, really is a spiritual principle. And if we lose the spiritual principle, we might as well just speak the language of the time and place. And so maybe that's a long answer to a short question, but Val, I'll fire back at you. Sorry about that.
Well, you've given me a nice setup, actually, Ramsey. Thank you, Mihiana. Yeah, I mean, just to piggyback off that, of your kōrero, I suppose it goes back to you use the Kohanga Reo movement and now the Kurakopa movement as examples for many Indigenous language revitalization efforts across the world. And essentially, fundamentally, that is Maori or Indigenous led and informed. And so that becomes a sense of mana motuhake or agency. And so really, when we're talking about being culturally responsive, actually anything we were trying to be culturally responsive actually should be led by the Indigenous people. We should be at the decision-making table. If we're not on the decision-making table, then often we're on the menu. And if we're on the menu, then we're not the dominant voice, and our voices are marginalized. And therefore, you are going to get, through even the best of intention, not the desired outcome. So it does come down to that, that we need to have our spaces. Those spaces need to be created for us, but also it's about the rebalance of the imbalance of power and resource. And so if you wanted to do a really good job, those are the things that has to change at a governance level, at a system level, system disruption and innovation. And disruption need not be a bad thing. It's actually part of change. It's part of evolving our mindset, evolving the culture, so we're responsive to the needs. So anything in that space, yep, it needs to be led by Indigenous peoples. Regarding the classroom, yes, absolutely right. It needs to be taken out of the classroom. I would often say to my real students that the classroom is the most unnatural place that you can learn a language. The most natural place is if you actually take it outside of the classroom into your natural environments, the cup of tea station, the water, the lunch bar, on the street, catching the bus. That's where your language is going to thrive. And so it's about creating that mind shift and that cultural shift within self to then, I suppose, perpetuate to the people that you have relationships with, like my tamariki, like our wider whānau. So it actually becomes something that was once upon a time different to actually, this is actually quite normal. So, yeah.
Nigel, if I may, I think we're also understanding that sometimes when we're speaking, one word has 100 meanings rather than the other way around. So there's a tendency for people to look for singularities because it's faster, it's easier. But in our culture worldview, each thing has a specific identity. So I'm holding it, and you ask me what it is. It depends on who's in the room, what day it is, and whether I'm throwing it at you or whether I'm holding on to it, right? What could be a paperweight becomes a weapon. It has its own identity, but because we tend to look at things in singularities in the continental worldview, the island world is looking things in a multicultural, pluralistic world, and not just a singular world. And there's place for all of it, but again, these are the multiple truths. But we're not trying to make my truth your truth. I think that's the challenge.
Yeah. And if I could add on to that as well, in terms of understanding how school systems can implement culture responsive curriculum and policies, that could safeguard Indigenous languages and cultures, is to also understand that school systems on island nations specifically, but also in other Indigenous countries, were heavily affected and impacted by colonization. So colonization suppressed all these languages and cultures for centuries on end. So we have to also decolonize these aspects within our school systems in order to also productively, successfully implement these things, to recognize, hey, our school system is actually inherently colonial, and we have to deconstruct it and add our own indigeneity twist to it. For example, like, learning languages outside of the classroom. That's how I also learned a lot of my Indigenous just the nature, just the names of specific things. That's how I learn, not in the classroom. So I think it's also to deconstruct that notion of, oh, I have to be in a classroom in order to learn this. It's a very colonial way of thinking as well. So yeah, I'm not sure if you could squeeze one tiny question. We have 5 minutes, but this one would be specifically for Nigel. I think if you could give like 2, 3 sentences regarding this one. This one was a question in the chat. What efforts has UNESCO made to support indigenous communities in reclaiming their territories, especially in regions where climate change has had a severe impact and where government interventions appear to be lacking?
So it's a good question, and it's a question that often comes to us. And I need to emphasize that UNESCO is part of the UN system, so we're made up of member states. So we are responsive to the governments that sit at our executive board and our general conference. Having said that, there's a policy on engaging with Indigenous peoples, and the Secretariat's very committed to that. But also, there's a very positive political alignment at the moment. So we have a number of important governments and many governments that are more sensitive and more aware about how important Indigenous knowledge and languages are. We don't get into directly questions about territoriality, but if you unpick this dynamic, you can see how sustainability in the face of biodiversity and climate is inherently about taking care of the land. And often in these international meetings, it's the Indigenous people who are able to describe this most clearly from their own practices and in their own language and their own concepts. And as one of the Nicaraguan leaders said to me, Indigenous leader Myrna Cunningham, who many of you know, we know what we know as Indigenous people. Our challenge is to get to the table and convince the people who are with us at the table, let's work as a team, let's do this together. And Indigenous concepts don't just apply in Indigenous territories, they apply globally, they apply on a very big scale. And this is kind of what's exciting about an island dialogue, because people from very different parts of the world recognize each other's story and give each other solidarity in that. So we encourage governments and Indigenous peoples to work together to develop your national action plan on the International Decade on Indigenous Languages. And we have teams all over the world supporting Indigenous people on their research, advocacy, and actions on both climate change and biodiversity. And you will see us in Cali, Colombia next month, working on the Nature Culture Summit, which will be a global forum on these interface of culture, language, and territory. So,
Wonderful.
And you're always welcome to get in touch with the national office.
Wonderful, thank you. And yeah, I would like to just round off this very, very interesting and important dialogue that we just had. If each one of you wants to give a closing remark or just a final say in what you want to say, now would be the time.
I would just like to thank everyone for this opportunity, and again, challenge us to move the needle. So what now? What do we do next? And it would be real interesting that at the next island innovation, that the backdrop we're using actually shows islands rather than continents.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
Anyway, just a thought.
Yeah.
Nothing more from me actually, but thank you, Nigel, for the wonderful facilitation. It's a skill weaving together 3 different speakers together and keeping the narrative not only consistent but also diverse and real thought-provoking and deep. So thank you very much for you and for the rest of the whānau at the virtual summit. E mihi ana kia tātou. Ramsey, Nigel, nei te mihi.
Likewise. Aloha.
Thank you. It was brilliant. Nigel, thank you very much. And a great pleasure to meet you both. So,
pleasure. Be well, as we say.
Thank you so much for attending this meeting and also guest speaking at this really cool dialogue that we had just had. I just started my morning, so for the rest of the day, I'll just be thought provoked, just constantly thinking about this conversation as well. So it's really, really nice to have all of you here. With gratitude, I would like to say thank you so much for being a part of this. And yeah, we'll just continue to do what we have to do.
Thank you to our moderator, Nigel Maduro, and to all our respected speakers for their valuable insight. Very inspiring session. We appreciate your time and expertise. For all of you who might have missed it, we announced very exciting news during our opening session. Island Innovation is partnering with Government of St. Kitts and Nevis to host Global Sustainable Island Summit. After this year's experience in Prince Edward Island, Canada, now the Caribbean takes the spotlight. The summit will be held in May 2025, that is next year. We will be discussing solutions and advancements in sustainable energy. So please note that all attendees of the virtual island summit can get an discount on early bird ticket using the coupon VIS2024. Check out in the chat for more detail. So our next session, I can see it is in less than 1 hour. We have session titled Voice from Mediterranean. We encourage you all to join us for that as well. You can follow Ireland Innovations Instagram, LinkedIn, and other social media for news and updates. You can see in the chat where to click. And thank you all once again for being part of this great session. We appreciate your time and contribution. Goodbye, and we hope to see you all at our next session.